Hey everybody, what's going on? It's Dean Meadows with the Daily Apologist. This is the Daily Apologist podcast. Super excited for today's interview. Super excited that you're tuning in with us on YouTube or on Anchor. I have a really awesome guest. I have interacted with this guy in Austin when I visited there. Super cordial, super nice. And I was like, man, whenever I get the opportunity, I'm going to have Genetically Modified Skeptic on the show to talk everything from background to God's existence to evidence for Christianity. And it is a great pleasure for me to introduce and bring in to your screen, if you're watching on YouTube, Drew McCoy, Genetically Modified Skeptic. Drew, I have been waiting for this opportunity because I think you're just a swell guy, and I really enjoyed our time in Austin. How you doing, man?
I'm doing great. Yeah, I've actually been really looking forward to doing some kind of interview or podcast or something with you ever since we met, just because seeing how you interact with people in person and online, I think you set a really good example of positive discourse. It doesn't matter what your position is. I think that you set a good example of how to actually have a productive and kind conversation filled with compassion and empathy online. That's not really very easy to do. I've screwed up a bunch of times in doing that myself. I think you've done a good job. So I'm happy to be here.
I appreciate that. I can remember, coming to Austin. I think it was like last year or the year before that. Stayed at Eric Murphy's house. Stayed at Eric Murphy's apartment along with Thomas Wellhouse, and I can remember that. Who was it? Yeah, we were with Eric. It was me, you, Eric. Objectively Dan, Holy Kool-Aid. We all went out, and you guys told me that Austin had one or two barbecue shops in the area, and
yeah,
and we went out and had barbecue, and it was great. We talked about the similarities that we have, the differences that we have, and it was just a great time. Really, at 33 years old, as a professional apologist, it was really one of the highlights of not just my professional career, but my personal career. I really, my personal life as well. So it was at that moment that I was like, if I can ever get a chance to get Drew on the show, but even then before that, I was like, man, if I can ever just get the equipment to do this, I definitely want to have you on the show. So thank you once again for taking your time out of your busy schedule to come on and talk to me. So I appreciate that.
Absolutely. Very happy to be here.
So for people who don't know you, maybe have never heard of you, real quick, how long have you been doing the whole been on the YouTube scene? How long have you been doing that?
So I started my channel, posted my first videos at the end of March 2017, and then I want to say the beginning of May 2018, I actually quit my job and was able to go full time on YouTube, just basically being a YouTuber. Now, I call myself an atheist activist. I guess that's my job title, which kind of means that a lot of my work, probably at least half, if not like over 60% of my work, doesn't really have to do with just me making videos. I make videos because I want to get like my message out there and have a certain kind of influence out there and all of that. But it also just allows me to take as much time as I need to help people who contact me who have any questions. Or I think that a big part of the way that I see my role in all of this is when people come to me with questions, I'm not really trying to directly give them answers or make them like an atheist. I'm not really super interested in that. What I like to do is when people are coming out of a situation where they're hurting and they don't have people around that will take the time to listen to them and understand them, regardless of what kind of situation they're coming out of, I try to do my best to give them resources and some encouragement that, that shows them that they're worth it and they have some tools at their disposal to cope with trauma or abuse or even loneliness. There's quite a price to be paid in a lot of parts, especially the U.S. in the South, for becoming an atheist or just leaving your religious community, whether that means that you're an atheist or not, or maybe it means that you're like an ex-atheist. I don't know. There can be a price to pay when you leave your religious community. And I try to be there to pick up the pieces rather than just, oh, hey, everybody should be an atheist.
Gotcha.
So,
and I think that's one of the reasons, why your channel really does separate itself from a lot of the other, atheist content creators channel, is because you seek to do that. And while you and I, and I'm sure we're going to explore this along the way, while you and I are going to disagree on a lot of things, it is good that in instances where, in my opinion, where Christian families and Christian people don't act the way that they should, and they do seriously scar people who are have now moved to the atheist community. I'm glad that there are people like you there to say, hey, you don't have to deal with this. There's a way to heal from this, and that's encouraging. While I'm not sitting here saying, hey, I think everybody should be an atheist. I certainly don't. I am glad that there are people on the other side to really help people who have been scarred, unfortunately, by people who supposedly love them but don't act that way. So, so let me go ahead and start like the formal line of questioning. So you would classify yourself as an atheist activist, and I guess my first question is, what is your background? I mean, were you somebody who kind of grew up in a Christian home, a Christian culture, or were you somebody who was like, well, we're kind of nominal, we kind of go to church every now and then, and it really never took? How would you describe, your upbringing, I guess I would say?
Yeah. So one of the ways that I think that a lot of religious scholars describe, or at least, scholars of religious studies will describe religion is, I guess there's a couple of different categories. There's when belief precedes practice, and when practice precedes belief. Now, it's not quite that black and white, but for me, we did not practice above belief. We believed, and that's why we practiced. Mm-hmm. So what that means is, when I go on the whole spiel of, oh, we went to church 3 times a week, and both of my parents were very active in the church, and I was one of the kind of leaders of the youth group, and I was really involved in that. I was homeschooled basically for religious reasons, because my parents preferred that I not be taught evolution in public school. Things like that. When I say stuff like that, sometimes people say, oh, that doesn't mean that you were actually a Christian. And yeah, that's completely true. That doesn't mean that I actually believed it. But the reason why we went to church times a week, the reason why we did all of that, the reason why I was very invested in learning about apologetics and even interested in going into ministry by the time I got to college, was because I was completely dead set on the idea that I had a personal relationship with Jesus Christ, who sacrificed himself on the cross to atone for our sins. Yeah. So yeah, and we talked, when we talked about that in person, we had some similarities with that. But I'll say, when was it that I actually kind of started to question all of that? I don't want to get ahead of myself here as far as describing my background. But I guess another detail is, I am the first in 4 generations of men on my dad's side of the family not to be a missionary. Oh, wow. So my great-grandfather was not a Christian and actually converted and then became a missionary and started, I wish I could tell you the name of it, but I don't want to dox anybody, basically. Started a rather large mission in Mexico, and he was succeeded by his son, my grandfather, who was then succeeded by my father and some of the family and family friends. And now eventually my dad ended up leaving the mission field after my sister was born, and then I was born after that. And it was not, I wouldn't say expected within my immediate family that I would go into ministry, but if on my dad's side, it was definitely expected that all men would go into ministry. If I wasn't to go into what we call full-time ministry, I was expected to make whatever I did full-time my ministry, so if like that meant I was going in,
tent maker mission work.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. So I studied psychology in college, and my plan with that was, for a little while, was to open up a Christian practice. And then I decided, I think what I want to do is actually go to a place where there's not a lot of Christian counselors, and kind of just fly under the radar a little bit and hopefully be an example and an influence for Christ to build his kingdom there. And so that was kind of my plan at the age of about 19, 20. Mm-hmm. And, needless to say, that's not quite the path in life that I ended up going down.
It's definitely not the arrival point that you came to. And I guess that's my next question. So here's this, somewhat of a pretty consistent pattern in your family, consistent expectation that, hey, if all the men are either going to be missionaries or going to make their job their mission field. And so obviously that isn't where you landed. So I guess my question would be, how did that all take place? Because as I've told other guests, it has to be, it's just hard for me, as a Christian to really grasp and get a hold on the, I don't even know how to use words to describe it. I don't want to say pressure, but I'll just say pressure. The pressure of, all right, I am no longer sure that this is what I believe over here. And then on the other side, it's, goodness, if I come out of this and I don't believe, what the world is my family going to think? So two-part question here. What kind of started you on the path, and what was kind of the process of you deconverting? And then how did you deal with this other family piece over here that goes along with that?
Yeah. So I'll try to keep it relatively brief with the deconverting thing, because it is, it's a long story, as I think it should be for such a big, I call it a decision, not that I think that beliefs necessarily are something that you always choose. But so the groundwork here is that I was raised independent fundamental Baptist. So that meant that we thought the Bible was inerrant. There's no flaws, there's no error, there are no contradictions. We took it not entirely literally, to the point where we thought that all of the parables that Jesus told were all literal, but most of it was quite literal, to the point where we were sixth-day creationists, young Earth creationists. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the groundwork there that needs to be known in getting into this. So the way that I tend to describe this is that there was a long set of dominoes set up, and slowly a few dominoes started to fall just one by one, until eventually there were so many falling all at once, or so many had fallen, that there was a bit of a cascade. And the entire worldview was just toppled at a certain point. Now, it's hard to say exactly where it starts. Maybe I would say that the very first domino to fall would be me studying for my psychology degree, and doing some social psychology classes and research that showed to me that what we call spiritual experience or religious experience is something that we observed to be reliably testable, reliably inducible, and consistent across time and cultures and religions. So,
all right, clarify that for a little bit.
So I grew up thinking that if I am for me, it wasn't so much worship. I wasn't a hands waving, caught up in worship kind of person. I was a quiet reflection, caught up in the spirit during study kind of person. That was relatively frequent for me growing up, and when I was a little younger. So say that I am doing my devotions and I'm very deep in prayer, and I am basically feeling what I would interpret to be the Holy Spirit. I was taught that the Holy Spirit could come to you and that you were feeling the Holy Spirit's presence. Jesus didn't necessarily audibly whisper in your ear, but you could learn things through some kind of inspiration, especially through revealed messages in the Word.
Yeah.
And so that's how I was raised. I was raised to interpret that experience as something that was supernatural, supernaturally explained, and there was nothing else that could induce that kind of thing. So fast forward to when I get to college and start studying for my counseling psychology degree, I start to learn that, well, other people in other religions have experiences that they would describe, which are very, very similar to my own in Christianity, even though their religion contradicts a lot of the things that I think.
Mm-hmm.
So what is that? Is that at first I thought, oh, maybe that's demons or it's Satan's influence getting people into an emotional state that fools them into thinking that it's the Holy Spirit. And then I found that a lot of these types of experiences happen across multiple religions, across time, across cultures. And so I thought, it's a little bit hard for me to wrap my mind around the narrative that all of these people all have these experiences which they report and can be actually tested scientifically to be biochemically, like neurologically, very similar. And apparently only my experiences are supernatural in origin and can truly be said to be because of the Spirit. Everything else is something else. That seemed like a kind of difficult narrative to swallow. I still did swallow it and said, well, I don't know that it's necessarily Satan influencing all of these people, because I also think that there are people who are genuinely Christian who could not necessarily be directly demonically possessed, which that's what my theology taught me, at least, that have experiences which they say should be attributed to the Spirit, but I don't think that they are. And basically that meant that I was like, well, my experiences and some of the experiences of other people that I've learned about, I think were because of the Spirit. And everybody else's, well, I think that Occam's razor should tell me to cut out all the assumptions and think maybe those are naturalistic in origin.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got to the point where I started learning about how these experiences could actually be induced. And I'm not talking about the myth of the God helmet that a lot of atheists like to tout. They don't realize it's totally overblown and exaggerated. I'm not saying, you could go into a lab and put this like helmet on your head and it immediately makes you feel God. Yeah. There's electrochemical stimulus that you can put into your brain that will give you something that a lot of people report as a mystical experience. But definitively, like seeing what you know to be God and that all the scientists know to be God or something, and that's naturally induced. No, that's first of all, that doesn't fit with methodological naturalism within the methodology of science. So that's kind of a bunch of mumbo jumbo. But I did see that we could reliably induce experiences, whether it's through psychotropic drugs or especially through rituals, things like the Sufis do, a lot of circling and chanting and meditations and deprivation of sleep and deprivation of food. All of these things could actually get you into an altered state of consciousness. And when you're in that state, by natural means, you would often, like a lot of people across cultures and across religions would report that, well, they had a mystical experience or a supernatural experience. And so that didn't necessarily tell me that my supernatural experiences, like with the Spirit, were false. It just showed me that I couldn't really demonstrate that they were anything but natural. I couldn't demonstrate that they were absolutely natural, but it did cast a little bit of doubt on that. Mm-hmm. And so that's the first domino to fall. Eventually, I did some master's coursework in human sexuality, and I became convinced of the naturalistic genetic origins of homosexuality and gender nonconformity. I could get into all of the genetic factors that make kind of psychologists and psychiatrists think that, but I'll gloss over some of the details just for time's sake. But I kind of got to the point where I, was taught that it was a sin to be gay, but also it seemed to me in this master's course, which was taught at a Christian school, that all of the material was, and all the research was showing that being gay was something that you couldn't actually stop yourself from being. Now, you could be celibate, And so I thought, oh, maybe if you're gay, then like the thing that you need to do is be celibate, and that's how you live in accordance with God's law.
Yeah.
And I found research that showed that being celibate, exclusively celibate when you are gay or just like gender nonconforming, doesn't actually provide the greatest mental health environment. There's a lot of trauma and a lot of abuse that's associated with those kinds of things. Outcomes for celibacy long term aren't really that great. Maybe the Apostle Paul could do it, but I don't think a lot of us can. And so that was another domino to fall. I thought, well, why is God telling us to do something which we can demonstrate scientifically to not be great for our health? It seems very different from other sins. Maybe you're genetically inclined to be an alcoholic, but at least if you're not an alcoholic, that is demonstrably better. But it seemed to me that it was pretty demonstrable that if you were in an environment which was not filled with prejudice, and you were in especially a long-term monogamous relationship, if you were gay, that wasn't something that really was a detriment to your happiness there. And if you were celibate, it did seem to be a detriment to your happiness and well-being. And so that was another domino to fall. Eventually, I also started looking into basically evolution by natural selection. And because a couple of other things had been challenged, like my frame of mind on personal experience and my frame of mind on homosexuality, I decided to kind of look a little bit deeper into evolution to challenge some of my ideas on creationism. And I came into it with, well, I know what science is. I've done statistics and research methods, which was a year-long course in my undergrad degree. I had to write research for myself. I know how this stuff works. So I think that if creationism is it, then I think I might be able to tell, or at least there won't be a lot of doubt cast on that if I investigate evolution. And that was absolutely not the case when I was looking into the research methodologies that creationists would use in published journals, which were already few and far between. I didn't find much convincing evidence there, and the methodologies that the evolutionary biologists would use to prop up this theory, I thought were very rigorous, and I couldn't poke holes in it. Now, and that's not to say I thought all the research was perfect or anything like that, but it definitely seemed that evolution was a lot more probable than creation, or at least 6-day creation, right? Now, I kind of got to the point with all of that and believing I have a whole video about how starlight made me realize that I didn't think that 6-day creation was a thing. I didn't think that the universe really was less than 10,000 years old, because starlight and the observations and tests that we can kind of entertain based on that does not really support the idea that the universe is much younger than 13.84 billion years old. So all of this made me reinterpret the Bible, and in that process of trying to reinterpret my kind of literalist attitude, I simply could not find a methodology that allowed me to reliably find an interpretation of the Bible which could be objectively verified, that I could place a high degree of confidence in the same way that scientifically researching something could allow me to have a high degree of confidence in.
Gotcha. So I guess, and one of the things and I appreciate you sharing all that. And so, admittedly, I am no expert in gender studies. I'm no expert in psychology. So I guess the only thing that I would say, not necessarily in like super blunt debate format or anything like that, but I do think that there are some questions that we need to ask as Christians with regards to, one, how we treat the LGBTQ community, regardless of what we think. I think the church has done a pretty bad job of not just in the way that we treat them, but in the way that we interact as well. So I would just say to that end, the church should do a better job regardless of what we think about that. But with regards to, and I'd love to see the studies as far as the celibacy goes. There's a gentleman by the name of Christopher Yuan. I don't know if you know who he is or not.
Yeah, I actually he actually came to my my college and spoke, and he was that speech was the thing that I was like, oh, and I started researching into whether or not someone could be ex-gay or not, and
I just think that his example is, I met him at Biola one year. That was back when Summit Ministries still had their, I think it was like a 2-week deal at Biola, and he was speaking, and he sat down, at our table, and I just asked him. I didn't even know who he was at that point. I just knew that he was some guy at the table, and he told me who he was, and I asked him why he was there. He's at Summit Ministries. I didn't know anything about his story, and then he shared it with me, and so I find that to be at the very least, I'm not saying that he is, the barometer by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think that that his case is very peculiar, to say the least. Now, looking at the evolution issue, it kind of seems to me you're telling me that was one of the pillars that kind of knocked, that fell for your faith. And this is a question that I've asked other guests. I don't want to out who they are because I want people to listen to that episode.
Yeah.
Say that is correct, that the 6-day creationist view is just patently false. And really what is being said there in, the first 2 chapters of Genesis is either some type of mytho-historical viewpoint, framework viewpoint, or Hebrew poetry. And I don't want to push this all the way down to what would bring you back to Christianity or what would make you a Christian. But in looking at that, did you examine those viewpoints? And if you did, what about those viewpoints just didn't stick or hold for you?
Yeah, so I actually, in my very last semester of college, I took a course in poetical books, and that was my favorite. I have a minor in Bible from a Christian university, and that was my favorite. It was my favorite course. I loved poetical books, and honestly, if I could take more of those classes, I probably would. And I mean, yeah, if I was seeking further education, I probably would do that. I will say that I tend to view, while I'm not entirely sure, I do tend to view Genesis, or at least the creation story, as some kind of, it's mythology and poetry. The first few sentences that Adam said about,
category called like mytho-parallelism or something like that.
Something like that. But it stood out to me in learning in that class that, it seemed like the very first thing that Adam ever said to Eve was in like a formally like standardized version of Hebrew poetry, and like the first thing he says is poetry. And I realized from that, while I was still kind of like exploring the idea of evolution being a thing, that it may be poetry. Now I'm okay with accepting that view. The issue kind of ended up coming down to, somewhat informed by evolution, that there are so many possibilities for conflicting interpretation coming from this text that is supposed to be the most like upstanding divine source of inspired inerrant knowledge. Like it's supposed to be this message from God, this perfect message. And I don't know that I can call something a perfect message or call an author flawless or perfect if there are so many different possible interpretations from that message,
right,
that people, regardless of how hard they try, even if they're trying their absolute hardest, which I think tons of people with different interpretations do, come to different interpretations and conflict, and then possibly act on those interpretations, which could lead their soul to, to go astray. And so it really comes down to my idea of how the Bible could be interpreted feeds into the problem of evil, right? That's what it ends up coming down to.
I guess my question would then be, what are we saying when we say that this is perfect? Because perfect can be, I'm not saying that you're using it this way, but it can be maybe a nebulous term, maybe something that is not hard and fast defined when we say that the Bible is a perfect book. So what do you mean when you say, this is perfect?
I would say that at least when we're talking about, I guess my best definition for this purpose would be that I would expect for a message that is supposedly from a divine being that is supposed to lay out a path towards salvation would be intelligible enough to where people who were genuinely trying their hardest to understand it could not be led astray. They would be entirely convinced of it. And I don't think that it has to violate free will or anything like that. It could be something that, just as long as you do want to actually know the truth, you could. And I don't think that that's actually the case. I think that there are people like you, and there are Christians that I know that I think want to know the truth and do truly believe that they're going to find divine truth in Scripture, and yet they come to different conclusions. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that seems like, well, if a God wanted people to all come to a certain conclusion that could lead to salvation, then he's not doing that. And so my options for explaining why that is kind of don't end up including an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient being.
Well, couldn't it be, hypothetically, couldn't it be that the book is divinely inspired, and depending on your religious slant on free will, couldn't it be that even if, and I would say to a certain degree that even if the problem that you are suggesting was solved and it was as clear as it could be, and I'm trying to enter into your worldview,
right?
Even if it was completely obvious and that problem was solved, that there would still be people given free will who would twist it, manipulate it for the purpose of deceiving people. I mean, even in, I think it's like Second Peter, at the very end of Second Peter, the author of Second Peter, if you take that view, I think it's Peter, says that there are people who do twist the scriptures to their own destruction. So I guess my question would be, isn't it possible that people in their free will subdue what they know to be true in order to use something like this to manipulate people, or to I guess that would be my question to you. Like, even if it were clear, how do we know that people in their free will wouldn't still do it? Because we see in Scripture, just roll with the hypothetical here. We see in Scripture that even if all the events did take place, that there are times where God does absolutely positively show up, tell people what to do, and in their free will, they still disobey, they still challenge, or they still pass the buck. Like somebody like Saul, who's anointed by God, does these things, and then says that he's carried out the command of God, and he really hasn't. Right. Even after being clearly instructed to do A, B, or C. So I guess my question is, with that piece of the puzzle, how do you navigate that?
Well, I think in order to have Scripture hold up in its claim that those who don't accept the path to salvation or accept a certain understanding of Scripture are going their own way, are twisting it, are purposely misunderstanding, are suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. That would be the claim. It would be a positive claim. And I don't know that that claim has, one, been demonstrated, and two, I don't know if that claim is actually falsifiable to begin with. I think that we would have to actually demonstrate that people are, in fact, suppressing the truth and unrighteousness. And we would have to demonstrate that every person who has a different interpretation from, let's say we arbitrarily pick a certain interpretation, everyone who has a different interpretation than that, we'd have to prove is suppressing the truth and unrighteousness.
Right.
So until we can get to that point, I don't feel like that claim in Scripture has been sufficiently justified to the point where I can accept that Scripture is correct or is divinely inspired, because I feel that Occam's razor would necessitate thinking, well, we can't demonstrate that everybody is just lying or is being unrighteous or is kind of sticking their fingers in their ears or whatever. But we do know that people do interpret things different ways, because everybody interprets literature in different ways all the time. That's what literature is. So to me, that seems to be the more reasonable path to go down.
So for instance, and I'm gonna take a shot at it here.
Oh yeah, yeah.
With you. So for instance, I think that there would be some clear ways that we could, definitely say or show that somebody is deliberately, and tell me if I'm wrong here, someone's deliberately suppressing the truth or manipulating the text. So for instance, and this is just a hypothetical, if Jesus came off down from the Sermon on the Mount and said, he who believes in me will do 45 jumping jacks every Sunday, right? And that's, clearly an imperative that Jesus says something to the effect of, all of those who believe in me will do 45 jumping jacks on the Lord's day. And then, it's right after the Sermon on the Mount, preacher stands up and says, it says here that Jesus said after he came down off the Sermon on the Mount, all those who believe in me will do 45 jumping jacks on Sunday. And he just blatantly says, you don't have to do any jumping jacks. I think that would be a clear case of, here's the Greek structure of what Jesus said. That seems to be an imperative to all disciples. And here's a guy that's saying, actually, no, you don't have to do that. Or maybe another piece of the puzzle would be, say, the Great Commission, right at the very end of Matthew, go into all the world and preach the gospel to all creation. If someone stood up and said, you really don't have to do that. Like, that seems to me like someone would be blatantly taking what is there and saying, he didn't really mean that. So help me out. Tell me where I'm either missing the point or that isn't like actively demonstrating that someone's looking at something that is clear to all disciples and misapplying it or however you phrased it earlier.
Yeah. So I think that still that kind of imperative would rely on literary interpretation. So say that Jesus says that, you should do 45 jumping jacks, and everyone who does that is an actual disciple. And someone comes along and has a different interpretation of that and says that, oh, wait, but no, this is a test. Jesus is wondering whether or not we are going to do this and think that belief in doing jumping jacks is more important than actually doing the jumping jacks. Or there's still a myriad of ways that you could actually interpret it, and there's no objective basis to literary interpretation. There's no way that you can make literary interpretation objective. It's inherently subjective as a medium, and so that ultimately comes down to because I think that literary interpretation is necessarily and always subjective. I don't think that a divine being in infinite wisdom trying to communicate a reliable message to everyone would actually use literature at all. Because I think that even if you interpret it as an imperative, someone else could, in good faith, still interpret it differently because of some other context, or because maybe they didn't hear it in the correct context, or something like that. I even think that if they heard that imperative in the incorrect context, and they were like misled by someone else, and they practiced their entire life on the misinformation they got from someone else, and thereby didn't actually follow the proper path to salvation, then I think that that's actually on the person or the being that delivered that literature, especially if they were omnipotent, because they would have known that that person, even in their misunderstanding of it or being deceived by someone else, would have, through no fault of their own, not followed the path of salvation.
Well, I guess that's where I would respectfully disagree. I don't know. I think that there's just some things, even within literature, that everybody can objectively understand to be a objective imperative, I guess you could say. So I don't like for instance, when Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, I believe it's in somewhere between Matthew 5, 6, and 7, not sure off the top of my head, where he says, love your neighbor and pray for your enemies, right? And those who persecute you. I don't know how someone looks at that and says, okay, Jesus is saying to this crowd of disciples, love your neighbor, pray for your enemies and those who persecute you. Yeah. How we could arrive at a conclusion that's anything other than Jesus said, love your neighbors, pray for your enemies and those who persecute you. I mean, sure. I'm not saying that everything in Scripture is that clear cut. There's certainly things in Scripture like apocalyptic literature in the book of Revelation, right?
A little bit cryptic.
super, controversial. I'm not saying that there aren't gray areas that are developed based upon the context of where they are when they're writing that. But I think that there are certain areas where the passage itself clearly demonstrates a key teaching or a key principle or a key action that is meant for all disciples, for all time, for all places. And I'm still struggling to see how we could come to that and say, all right, well, this passage here clearly seems to be an imperative for all people, for all times, for all places, but that can be subjectively interpreted without somebody mishandling it. I guess that's where I'm coming from. I'll give you the last word on that, and then we'll move on.
Sure. So I do think that, again, that could be, it seems to us that would be really clear, right? But even with that passage specifically, now, this is a really extreme example, and I want people to know that I think that it's a very extreme example, and I don't think that vast, overwhelming majority of people throughout all time have ever thought anything like this. But I think that there are some people who genuinely have interpreted it this way. Some people who are not great moral character. I don't want to get you demonetized by saying the name, but they like to burn crosses. Have interpreted that verse as you should love your neighbor, as in those who are geographically close to you, as yourself. And in praying for your enemies, that does not necessarily mean praying for their well-being. It means that you should pray for God's will to be done in their life, which could be the damnation of their souls, which could be the decimation of their people, or anything like that. Now, you could also just hear that verse completely divorced from context and think that Jesus is speaking to a specific type of person, and you could interpret it that way. Or you could read it in its full context and realize exactly how and why this statement was put out there into the world during his day. And I think that you could come to at least slightly different interpretations of that passage, which seems like a direct imperative to us, even if you just didn't have 100% of the information, or if people have just slightly different deliveries or slightly different, if that information is presented in just slightly different ways, in ways that a person can't control, like they're just told that verse directly, or if they read it in its full context, you can still come to different conclusions because of that method of delivery, or the way that you first heard of it, or you can bring some implicit biases that you can't even control because you're not in control of your brain completely, like that you could bring into it. And so I think that regardless of how, if you say 2 + 2 = 4, I still think that people could interpret that like differently, because there's so many different contexts in which information can be presented and taken into account in a person's mind.
Gotcha. So essentially what you're saying is, because these things can be subjectively interpreted, there's not, and I know I said to give you the last word, but you provoked a thought in my head.
No, go ahead.
So are you saying that everything in the Bible can just be interpreted subjectively, no matter how much it seems like a direct objective imperative?
I think that the nature of literature and the interpretation of literature is subjective. I don't think there's such thing as objective interpretation in any literature at all. Now, that said, I think that we can look at things through textual analysis and in light of different archaeological and historical evidences that we have, and see what we think the author intended.
Okay.
So I think that can be done, certainly.
Gotcha.
But that doesn't mean to say that we could still, even in light of all of that, actually have a definitively objective interpretation that we could uphold as correct and necessary for salvation. I still don't think that it's a reliable enough path for me to justify belief in it being divinely inspired.
Gotcha.
by a deity who wants people to all understand it the same way.
And that's because, just from your point of view, just the nature of literature itself.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha. So we've just for the audience, I told Drew that we were going to go for an hour. We are 47 minutes in, and we've just been talking about the nature of literature and whether it's all subjective or there are objective pieces to it. So hold on, to your seats here. Hey, look at the bright side. This is just benefiting my goal to try and get the channel to 4,000 hours of view time. So
there you
go.
Well, I'll say really quick that the way that I really, okay, so Dean and I have been building each other up here, but the reason why I like talking to you is because when you disagree, it's your tone and your approach is collaborative, like you're wanting to work with me on it, rather than it being like this defensive thing, right? Like this, don't attack me,
you're
right?
being an idiot, Drew, and you're going to hell in a handbasket for disagreeing with me.
Right. And when atheists do all that stuff, like, oh, you're so dumb because you think of creation is real instead of evolution. No, that doesn't work. You should collaborate with people. I mean, debate can definitely change minds, but I think in a lot of instances, especially one-on-one, collaboration and conversation can really work wonders.
No doubt. And so that kind of leads me into the next series of questions that I had planned. That whole section about the Bible just wasn't even planned. It was organic. I like it. So the next question I have is, I understand that as an atheist, you reject all arguments for the existence of God. I'm completely okay. If you want to tell me that you don't, then I'll be the first one to welcome you to at least the theist side of the house. So of the ones that you reject, which is all of them, right? Which one do you find to be like, all right, that is completely and totally the weakest argument?
Yeah, it actually really goes pretty well in line with what we were talking about, the whole literature thing. This idea that everyone knows what the truth is, mm-hmm. and that people only disagree because they're being dishonest, mm-hmm. Because they're lying. Like, everyone knows there's a God. There's no such thing as an actual atheist. And yeah, like, everybody who calls himself an atheist really does believe in God. They just deny it for some reason. Now, from my point of view, this is kind of a tough thing, is because it's the issue of falsifiability of that idea is a little rough from either side. Mm-hmm. I think that there's maybe some tests that we could do, like you were talking about. There's some there's some tests that we could do to see whether or not people really do all just suppress the truth in unrighteousness. But from at least my perspective, with my own, pardon the term, soul searching, that's not me. I legitimately don't have a reason. I don't secretly believe in God and I'm just lying about it. I want to know. I mean, I started from a position, at the very least, of believing that if I got this answer wrong, I would burn in hell for all of eternity. And I really don't want that. You know, I was taught this from a young age. And so hell is still something that, like, I think about.
Yeah.
And it's frightening. And I don't want to go there. I don't want anybody else to go there. So I do truly want to know. And in my process of trying to figure this out, I have found myself at a point where I am an agnostic atheist. I don't accept any of the claims that, or the arguments for God's existence, and I'm being honest about it.
Mm-hmm.
So it's that idea that everybody that says they're an atheist is just lying. That's not something that's, you know, theologically consistent.
I would disagree with that line of reasoning towards an atheist as well. I think one of the I like to just give people the benefit of the doubt. So, like, when people say, "Hey, I've looked at it and I've, you know, become an atheist," while I completely disagree with their conclusion, I don't doubt the generosity of which they have searched. I mean, it would be like saying, if I were an atheist and became a Christian, they'd say, "Oh, well, you're just, you know, you're still an atheist in your heart. You're just suppressing it, you know, to be either socially accepted because you're in the minority, or because, you know, your girlfriend, your fiance is a Christian, so you're identifying as a Christian, but, you know, deep down inside, that stuff's not true." Right.
And I would never, as an atheist, I would never say that to someone when someone's like, "Oh, you know, I used to be an atheist and now I'm whatever." I'm not going to sit there and go, "Oh, well, you know, you're just lying about it. You know, you're an atheist." Like, no.
Yeah.
No, that's kind of absurd.
So yeah, I would agree with you that is probably the poorest way to approach that type of conversation with somebody who is an atheist. So that was the easy one to knock out of the park. So of the arguments that, unless you want to, you know, add on to that, if you want to, go for it.
I was just going to say, was it C.S. Lewis that came up with the term of bulverism?
Came up with what?
Of bulverism? Am I getting that right? Maybe I'm totally.
I have no idea.
It just, the idea that you can discredit someone based on like teasing out what their motivations are rather than actually contending with their point. And, you know, that's what I think that is.
Or you're an atheist just because you want to sin all the time.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
If for those of you who are listening to this on Anchor, if you could have just seen the look on Drew's face when I said that, it spoke volumes. Those of you on YouTube, you'll be able to see it and catch what I saw. So, all right. So I guess the next question is the direct opposite of that, of the arguments that you reject for theism or Christianity. Which one do you find the most convincing?
I think that the most convincing across the board too, I think the reason why I rank this one as number one, even though it's not been something that has been particularly convincing for me, and in fact, it was the first domino to fall. I rank this one highly because it affects so many other people, and I'm under no illusions that I am somehow superior and immune to this. But I think it's personal experience.
Personal experience.
Yeah, I think that, like, if you look at someone like William Lane Craig, he says that even if all of the arguments, all the apologetics,
Drew, easy. That's my boy.
Calm down. I know, and he really does uphold these arguments as truthful, and I don't really doubt that he believes the arguments that he uses are worthwhile, and are worth putting out there to convince others. But even for someone like him, I tell me if I'm wrong, but as far as I know, I've seen him say that even if all of that was stripped away, if all these arguments were stripped away, he can't deny the communion he's had with the Spirit.
No, that's true. That's true that he would say even if all the arguments were gone, the belief in the existence of God could be a properly basic belief off of religious experience. Now, personally, I haven't done a lot of study in properly basic beliefs, but I actually, this is going to be a shocker. I tend to disagree with Craig on that point, just because it seems to me that subjective experiences are, and maybe you could fill in the blank here for me, subjective experiences are so tough to nail down about what specifically that was or was not.
Yeah.
Right?
The
Because
interpretation of
for
one's
me,
personal
you get
experience.
into, for me, you get into religious pluralism and you say, okay, I believe God based upon my religious experience that I had at camp. Well, I don't deny the experience. Well, what about the Muslim or the Hindu or the Buddhist or the Mormon that has a religious experience and it confirms, the specific route that they would claim leads to God? How do you differentiate, or how do you say that one person's religious experience is objectively better than another person's objective experience? I mean, or subjective experience. So for me, that just
Right.
kind of gets down into the mud and the muck of subjective personal experiences. And really, the only thing that you could show there, I think that you can only have, and if Dr. Craig wants to talk to me about it, I'd be more than happy to talk to him about it. Um, it basically comes out as a wash, in my opinion. And so then what do you have left to differentiate my belief in Christianity over the Muslims' belief in Islam if the baseline is, well, the experience that I've had? Seems to me you have to go somewhere else to supplement that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so I think I agree with you there more than I would agree with William Lane Craig. I really have very little to add that you didn't say on that. It's really that the interpretation of one's spiritual experience is just not something that you can necessarily falsify, especially when it didn't occur under lab conditions. Now, that doesn't mean that I accept all spiritual experiences as legitimate or as genuine. I don't accept everybody's interpretation, but that's because it's unfalsifiable. It's not something that can be demonstrated, and it's not something that can be falsified.
So
really?
Sorry, go ahead.
It's really, if I can't tell other people that their experience, and other people can't tell me that my experience didn't happen, and I'm under no illusions that my brain is not a brain that is built to accept personal experience instinctively and intuitively over all other forms of evidence. Well, so maybe if something happens, then I would believe, and it couldn't be falsified or verified, but maybe it would convince me. I don't think so right now, but
I guess that goes to my next question. It falls in line in the category of what would it take for you to be a Christian again? Is there some type of religious experience that you could have, whether individually or collectively with other people, that you would come to the conclusion of, okay, I have concluded that that's definitely a religious experience, and so at least on the table is theism?
Yeah. So it's hard to say whether or not this would be in the realm of spiritual experience or if it would be something else. But where I would need to start, at least with theism, there would need to be some kind of reliable means to interact with the supernatural in a way that's verifiable and repeatable across time and across people groups. So essentially, I would need some kind of experiment or some kind of measurement that we could do that could show us, oh yes, there is this thing that falls in line with some kind of coherent definition of the supernatural, first of all. And essentially, I would need there to be a way that we could reliably interact with the supernatural in the same way that we can interact with the natural. Now, would that mean that everything that is supernatural at that point we would just call natural, or would there be some distinction? I don't know. I would need some kind of reliable means to actually communicate with a god or some kind of divinity in a way that I know is not in a way that's not falsifiable, and or in a way that is falsifiable, in a way that is not like unprovable, like we were just talking about personal experiences are. And I have not found that way. And if I do, then I'd be pretty excited, because that would really open up a whole other part of the world, right? But I just haven't found that.
So do you? And I'm just asking the question. I'm not accusing you of this. So do you would you automatically take off the table some type of inductive experience with regards to the supernatural?
Okay, so describe that for me.
So, for instance, let me throw it out this way, and I'll use the example that I used in the previous episode. Originates with Michael Licona and his debate with Matt Dillahunty, where he tells Matt, he says, "All right, if we're sitting here on stage and some terrorists come in and they cut my head off in front of everyone, and everybody rushes out of the building, the police come, they subdue the terrorists. You've seen my head get severed from my body, and then I walk out of the building with the scars on my neck, and then I walk up to Drew and I say, hey, by the way, such and such a person who is beloved to you has passed away. They relayed to me this conversation that they had, and I thought it was interesting. Here are the details of that conversation." Would you say, obviously you saw it happen, but you didn't see anything that took place in the building, right?
Yeah.
So would that be something in a case where the inference to the best explanation would be, all right, we know the following, this is what happened. Inference to the best explanation is that seems to be a miracle given all the variables. Something like that. I'm not saying that specific thing, but something like that, where you don't have any direct access to a specific event, but an inference to the best explanation of what is the cause of that event.
So if I could explore it further and collect further data, maybe the model of reality that I have in my head of why all this happened makes predictions like a scientific hypothesis or theory does, and I can test those hypotheses, test those predictions, and find those predictions were in fact accurate, then I may believe that some kind of supernatural mechanism was involved. But if I couldn't do that, then it seems to me that I would be concluding that something supernatural happened because I don't have more data, because I can't explain it. Mm-hmm. And if there's something that I can't explain, and I can't explore it any further, then instead of coming to a conclusion that I think that most probably this happened, I'm going to say I don't know, because I just don't know. Mm-hmm. And that's where I have to land on it.
And I think the point that Licona is trying to make, and if Dr. Licona hears this and I'm wrong on it, just contact me and let me know where I'm wrong. I think the point that he's trying to make there is, well, we know from scientific study through years and years of human history that once a head is severed, there's no natural way, whether that is just in natural processes with the body laying next to the head or through surgery for a head to reattach itself, right? There's no natural way for someone to recount a conversation in the way that Licona describes it, where, hey, I had a conversation in which I didn't know your beloved loved one, but this is the conversation that we had, and you confirm that. I think what he's saying there is that in each one of those scenarios, or the pieces that he lays out, heads don't reattach themselves naturally. There's no way to do it through operation, at least to where the entire body would function again.
Yeah.
And having never met any of your family members to recall that type of conversation, there's no a naturalistic explanation for that either. So therefore, based upon not what we don't know, but what we do know, he would be saying that inductively you can conclude that something supernatural took place. So, I mean, I
I think
guess
that
my
would be
question is,
saying what we do know about the natural would allow us to say that the supernatural exists or was involved. But I don't know that anything that we know about the natural could allow us to conclude that something outside of the natural exists. And if we're not taking the natural to if we're not taking what we know about the natural to conclude that, and if we can't do that, which I don't think that we can, then it would be just we can't explain this, and so it must be something else.
Mhm.
Now, I at that point, I'd say I don't know what it was. Like, yeah, maybe it is a supernatural, and I wouldn't deny that it is something supernatural, but I also wouldn't confirm that either. I would have to default to the null hypothesis there that I can't actually say one way or the other what happened because I simply don't know. The what I know about reality is does not actually allow me to make a hypothesis or make some kind of educated guess on what happened unless I get more information.
And this is a follow-up question that I've asked previous guests as well. So I'm not trying to spring a trap or anything like that. So
yeah.
I guess my question then would be what, and I don't know if I've already asked this or not. Maybe I'm asking it in a different way. I'm not sure. What type of evidence for you is it? This kind of direct communication with a deity that you would need to have in order to say, all right, I've interacted with the supernatural or something like that? Because then what follows from that in my line of question would be, how would you know that you weren't just hallucinating, during that? So I guess those are
I
the two-parter for me.
I don't think that it would necessarily be direct communion with a deity.
Okay.
Like I there's a lot of things that I think are factual that I have not not directly seen. Like I think that black holes exist, but I've never seen like a much of a picture of a black hole before.
Or like dark
The
energy,
reason why I think
right, in the universe.
Well, I don't necessarily accept that dark energy is actually a thing. I think that hasn't quite made it to the level of theory. I think it's still hypothetical.
Okay.
It's a prediction is what it is based on some math involved in a lot of different types of cosmology.
Yeah.
Quantum theory.
We can do a whole
down.
podcast on that at some point.
Yeah, but I don't know that it would be direct communion with a deity, like me talking to something.
Yeah.
It's hard to say exactly what it would be because I would need some kind of coherent definition of what I'd be trying to look for, what I'd be seeing in the first place. The problem for me is I don't see much in the way of coherently defining something that I could think is reasonable or think that like it would be reasonable for me to think it exists if it's definitionally untestable, unmeasurable, unverifiable. I don't know how I could properly base belief in something that's definitionally unverifiable. I think that the only thing that I place any confidence in that's definitionally unverifiable is my fundamental axioms, right? And I don't think that I don't think that I have to accept that a creator deity, especially that has a nature that's in any way comparable to me, exists as some kind of axiomatic like foundation, right? I don't see that as necessary.
So sorry to cut you off, but couldn't other arguments, and I'm not saying just Christianity, I'm just saying theism in general, couldn't other arguments for a a theistic deity supply you with that definition. So, for instance, the ontological argument, if it's true, if it holds, and there's a lot of debate about whether it holds or not, if that holds, then there's your maximally great being. If the Kalam holds, there's your timeless, spaceless, immaterial, powerful, personal being. And if the teleological argument holds, there's your designer. And then if the moral argument holds, there's your maximally moral being. If those hold, couldn't that serve as and one would, I think one would argue, maybe outside of the ontological argument, the other ones are grounded in morality, which is experiential, fine tuning, which seems to be a fundamental part of the universe, and cosmology, which is a field of study that continues to grow. So if those were to hold, would that serve? I'm just asking for you personally. Would that serve as a basis for filling in the gap of not the gap? I don't mean to use that as a pejorative, but filling in that piece where you say, I don't even know how I could relate to something that is definitionally a problem for me.
That's a good question, and one that I have to think about a little bit more, I think, like, honestly. And I'm fine with admitting that. Mm-hmm. It's still difficult for me to think that we could, on the basis of information we've obtained through naturalistic means, come to some kind of confidence in something that exists outside of that natural framework. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of where my issue lies. Now, so for instance, let's say that the ontological argument holds. Mm-hmm. I don't think that necessarily means that being is what we would traditionally define as supernatural. Maybe it is a naturalistic being. I mean, honestly, one of the most convincing kind of arguments for there being some kind of creator, deity or entity comes in the form of the finale, the ending of Carl Sagan's Contact, where basically they discover that the very fabric of the universe has a fingerprint of design, which has been encoded in something that you can demonstrate every step of the way, was a message directly.
For a second there, I thought you were going to say the ending of Lost. And I was about to smoke you for that. No, I'm kidding. I see what you're saying there. So, I mean, I want to give the opportunity. I have pegged you with a lot of questions. You've been a great guest, and I appreciate that you've answered those questions honestly and with the right tone. So, is there anything that you want to ask me before we close the show?
I asked this because I think that you set such a good example of doing this without even having to ask me. How can I, as an atheist content creator and an activist in general, make it to where we can have more productive conversations and better relationships across these lines that we have?
I think that is a great question. And believe me, the way that I've gotten here, as far as tone and attitude, is from a multitude of years of mistakes. I think one of the things that we have a tendency to do, just as not just content creators, but as atheists and Christians, is I think twofold. One, I think too often our political ideologies infiltrate too much, in the sense that if I'm a Christian, I automatically think that because you're an atheist, you're a dirty, rotten, heathen liberal that's trying to tear down everything that I believe in the country that I love. And if I'm an atheist, well, I automatically assume that you're a Trump supporter you're a racist, you're a bigot, and you hate gays, right?
Right.
So I think first of all, we need to dismiss with that, because this, I personally think that while our worldviews will definitely impact our political beliefs, I don't necessarily know that in order to have a conversation about these things with regards to the existence of God, the truth of Christianity, that those things need to even enter the frame. I don't think
Yeah.
that even needs to happen. I think secondly, um, I think that there is, and I'm a fairly new YouTube content creator, and I think there's just too much of the desire that once we get to a certain sub number, we have to periodically feed our viewers just a bunch of red meat, right? For them to just
Yeah.
chow down on. And I think that that's the complete wrong way to go about it. So for instance, I know that if you ever did, uh, a video that picked up on something that I said or something that I misquoted or whatnot, and you had a little bit of fun with it, I wouldn't necessarily be offended, because guess what? I know you, and which is really weird. I've met you once. We've had a podcast, but I feel like I've known you for 5 years. Um,
Oh
and
yeah, no, actually
so, and I think
the
that's
feeling
the
is
other.
mutual, I
Yeah,
think.
I think that's the other piece to it. Like, in order to be a successful content creator and to defend the truth of the Christian worldview, I don't have to red meat every atheist I come in contact with,
Yeah.
right? And in the same way, I don't have to red meat every Christian. If I'm an atheist, I don't have to red meat every Christian that comes up on the radar.
Right.
I think if we do those, two things, I think that is beneficial. I also think that, and this is just from my experience, when I went to Austin a year ago, I think, yeah, it was about a year ago, a year and a half ago. Um, I fully expected to walk into the ACA and just be a lamb to the lions, right? I expected to walk in there, and I expected, I know I'd stayed with Eric. I expected Eric to pile on. I forget who else was there. I know V was there. I expected V to pile on. I expected for Dillahunty to blaze me. Um, just everybody. I expected everybody to just pounce on the guy in the church clothes, because Eric had made an announcement that I was coming, and I was like, "Oh, why did you do that?"
Oh no.
Because I was so nervous about it. But I got there, and it was very cordial, and I think the reason why I was able to develop those relationships and why I don't attack atheists vehemently as a content creator is because it's really hard to attack people that you genuinely get to know.
Yeah.
It would be super hard, almost impossible, for me to do a hit piece on genetically modified skeptic, right? I might say, all right, hey, here's a tweet. Let's break down this tweet, and this is where I genuinely disagree. But um, you know, I wouldn't be like, all right, here's a tweet by genetically modified skeptic. Let's just take a look at how big of an idiot this dude is, right?
Yeah.
I just couldn't do that because I know you. Like, I'm gonna do a Twitter Tuesday piece from a tweet that V did, and even before I decided to do it, I I messaged V and said, "Hey, do you have a problem with me doing this?"
Yeah.
Because I know V and I care about our friendship. And V's response was, "That's fine, but you should probably expect a reply." And I'm like, "Well, cool, that's
Yeah.
fine. I don't have a problem with that." So I think that needs to happen more. Um, and I think one way, the other way. I'm sorry, this is a long. I used to be a preacher. Long-winded answer, of course.
No,
Um,
no, you're
I
fine. This
think
is
one of the
all
things that we
excellent
can
advice
do
that I
as
stand behind.
subscribers, I think one of the things that subscribers really need to do is they don't need to support the bullies on each side. They really don't.
Yeah.
If subscribers would just say, all right, that's not productive, well, that kind of like, you know, gets me riled up or makes me laugh or do that. That's really in bad taste. That really doesn't advance the conversation. I don't need to have that channel as part of my subscription list. And those content creators will either adjust or they won't be monetized. So I think those are at least three ways that we can do that.
Yeah, I'm fully on board with
So
that. I totally stand behind all of that.
Yeah, and I want people to hold me accountable too as a content creator. I know
Right.
I have an organization behind me that will, but dude, if I get out of line and I make it, and it's hypothetical, I make a video and I mention you and you're like, man, dude, that was a hit piece. I expect you to contact me about that and say that doesn't help the situation at all.
Yeah.
So, just my 2 cents.
Yeah, and it's likewise. One issue with just kind of the atheist community and atheist YouTube community is that accountability can work differently. There's a little bit less of a formal structure there, and in places where there is a formal structure, a lot of the time people are so concerned about making sure that people say things the right way to represent atheists in a certain way that cancel culture arises, right?
Yeah.
And so we're either not holding people accountable enough, or we're holding people accountable for things they didn't do, or things that they could just apologize for.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, that issue of accountability is a really big one.
No doubt.
Yeah.
So, well, Drew / Genetically Modified Skeptic, it has been an honor. It's been a privilege. I hope that at some point, either you can come back here, I can come over to your channel and have a conversation about whatever you want to have a conversation about. Because I genuinely enjoy the time that we spent. We spent an hour and 20 minutes having the conversation. So that's 3 for 3, where I've said as I've invited people on, hey, we're only going to do an hour, and we end up going over. But I think that just is a product of the conversation that we're having and the way in which we're having that conversation. So once again, Drew, thank you so much. Where can people find all your stuff?
So you can search on YouTube for Genetically Modified Skeptic. You'll find me there. You can also search for Genetically Modified Skeptic on Facebook, GM_skeptic on Twitter. And, if you really want to, support me or anything like that, you want to find more of my stuff, you can pretty much go to my channel page, and all my social media will be linked there on the About page of my channel. And yeah, if anybody has any words of advice or questions or comments based on this dialogue, then if they want to send me a message on a social media platform or something, then hopefully I'll be able to cut through some of the noise that I get with my responses and messages, and be able to speak with people who have questions, comments, concerns.
Awesome.
But I am flattered to have, to be here. I thoroughly enjoyed this, and I look forward to working with you again. I'm sure this is not the last time.
Thanks, Drew. Take care, and I will see you when I see you. Take care, man. What a wonderful conversation with Genetically Modified Skeptic with Drew. To everybody who is watching or listening, that in a nutshell is what I would classify as a genuine conversation. Make sure that when we go out and we talk to people who disagree with us, that we take into consideration that, hey, they're human. Hey, 2, it's okay to disagree. And 3, there's probably going to be something said on either side for us and them to go back and rethink. And thank you so much for tuning in or for listening on Anchor. My name is Dean Meadows. This is the Daily Apologist Podcast. And remember to subscribe, hit the bell for future notifications. I'm signing off for the Daily Apologist Podcast. Remember, equip yourself to engage culture.